We're in Otrar in southern Kazakhstan. In Alchuk, the city's governor has fought hard. But now, it's all over. Even as the city's garrison deserted his side, Inalchuk fought on. He and his most trusted men barricaded themselves into the central citadel. As the invading hordes massed outside, he and his men prized bricks from the very walls and hurled them down at the assailants. But all that seems like a distant memory now. As the winter wind whistles across the plain, Inalchuk lays eyes upon the instrument of his death. It's a small crucible filled with molten silver, sizzling and spitting in the winter chill. His gaolers tell him what's to come. He'll be bound and chained. He'll lift his face up to heaven, and the crucible will be emptied into his eyes and ears. In life, you thought only of riches, they tell him. In death, your mind will be filled with the stuff. Inalchuk prays the end will come quickly. It probably does come quickly, but as the man's eyes and ears are filled with scalding hot molten metal, it probably doesn't feel quite quick enough. Inalchuk was not the only person to die at the fall of Otrar. Most of the city's inhabitants were put to death too. It was the first of the Khwarezmian cities to fall to Genghis Khan and his Mongol armies, and it laid the groundworks for what would follow as Genghis and his sons ripped across the empire, leaving it in ruins. Some resisted, they fought back against the invaders and did what they could to repel their armies. Some simply gave in, they threw open their gates and welcomed the Mongols into their cities. Most ended up in the same way. Like Inalchuk, they became victims of a ruthless streak that was evident from the very beginning. As a child of the wild Mongolian steppe, Genghis was no stranger to a bitter environment, violent struggle, and toughness made virtue. And as a son of the Burjigan chieftain Yesegul Bakhtar and his wife Hoylun, the future Khan knew something about political power and respect too. Known as Temujin at his birth around 1162, it was said the youngster was born clutching a lump of clotted blood in his hand, which was a sure sign that he would be a warrior. Aged only 10 years old, he was forced to fulfill this prophecy. When his father was poisoned by a group of Tatars out on the steppe, he and his elder brother, Bete, became direct rivals for the position of chief. Bete was probably 2 years older than Temujin, but was born to one of Yesugei's secondary wives. Temujin's mother, Hoylun, was Yesugei's primary wife. But this did not guarantee Temujin's succession. There was even the possibility that Bete would marry Hoylun and cement his power. Temujin wouldn't let this happen. Along with his younger brother, Khazar, Temujin set an ambush for Bete and killed him. This meant Temujin could succeed his father as chief, which was an important stepping stone towards his overall leadership of all the Mongol peoples. Murdering his half-brother may seem like an extreme move to our modern eyes, but this was what would-be chiefs needed to do to prove their dominance. Temujin was not the only one in town with a brutal streak. Another of the key figures in Temujin's early life was Jamuka. The two had been boyhood friends and had been sworn blood brothers, or anda. But Jamuka was a traditionalist. He believed in the existing confederation of clans led by individual warlords. Temujin had a different vision. He believed in uniting the clans under a central leader. That leader would be the best suited to the job, not merely the one with the most noble blood. This caused a rift with Jamuka's oligarchy of clans on one side and Temujin's meritocratic empire on the other. When the pair clashed at Dalan Baljut in 1187, Temujin suffered a heavy defeat. He fled the battlefield with his surviving soldiers. Around 70 were left behind and boiled alive by wrathful Jamuka. 17 years later, Temujin got his revenge. He defeated Jamuka and the other rival chieftains at the foot of Mount Naku. After the battle, Jamuka was executed. According to Mongol tradition, the noble Jamuka was afforded a bloodless death. Some accounts say his spine was broken with a heavy stone. This might not seem much like an act of mercy, but in many ways it was. Temujin could have put Jamuka to death any way he liked, and Jamuka had proved himself to be a ruthless, bloodthirsty type himself. Instead, Temujin granted him one final wish. Of course, this may have just been an act of political expediency. Temujin was out to unite the clans. Anyone who stood against him would expect to be put to death. But the fact that he followed the old customs would have shown him to be a just ruler, rather than just a violent megalomaniac, although he certainly could be that too. We see this mixture of leniency and political expediency elsewhere in Temujin's story. Shortly after his marriage to Borte in 1178, she was captured by the rival Merkit clan, probably as retaliation for the capture of Temujin's mother from them decades earlier. Borte was recaptured by Temujin, but the birth of her first son, Jochi, shortly afterwards led to some uncertainty over who the true father was. Temujin nonetheless raised Jochi as his own son. This meant he had one fewer enemy on the plains of Mongolia, but it was also a remarkably progressive move for the time. Less progressive was his subsequent revenge on the Merkits, who had, let's not forget, tried to steal his wife. By the time Temujin united the clans at the beginning of the 13th century, the Merkits don't seem to be among them. Temujin may simply have wiped them out of the gene pool. This was his first experiment with genocide, but it wouldn't be his last. This is the purest distillation of Temujin's legacy. There are flashes of wisdom and strategic brilliance. He brought unity and power to a region that had been fractured by tribal conflict for centuries, and the Mongols became feared by the Persian and Chinese civilizations that would previously have looked down on them. But the road to unity and to strength was littered with bodies, as Temujin laid waste to everything in his path. From 1206 onwards, Temujin was known as Genghis Khan. Now he would begin to cement the reputation of a great leader with an enormous capacity for brutality. This was brought into sharp relief during the conquest of Khwarezm, the Persian Empire stretching from modern-day Kazakhstan in the east to Armenia and Azerbaijan in the west. This is where Genghis Khan proved himself to be a formidable military commander who offered little mercy to his enemies. It was late 1218 when the Mongols sent a trade caravan to Otrar near the empire's northeastern borders. Suspicious of the Mongols and their motives, city governor Inalchuk had the 450 merchants of the caravan executed. Showing a modicum of restraint, an annoyed Genghis Khan sent envoys to the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II. Inalchuk's behaviour was unacceptable, Genghis Khan said. He must be punished, and the Khan must be compensated. Muhammad offered his own compensation. He severed the envoy's head and returned this to Genghis with two of his Mongol companions, each of whom had been forcibly shaved. The Khan would not forgive this insult, and so began the invasion and destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. First on the agenda was, of course, Otrar. Genghis and his sons arrived in autumn 1219 and put the city under siege. After months of this, the garrison commander, Karacha, finally gave up. He betrayed his masters, and the Mongols entered the city. Inalchuk, to his credit, fought pretty bravely. He and his most trusted men walled themselves up in the inner citadel and hurled bricks down at the invading army. It's possible that Inalchuk believed he could win. The Khwarezmian Empire had stood for 150 years by this point and had defeated the Seljuks and the Ghurids, and even threatened the Abbasid Caliphate. They were the dominant force in the Persian lands, and they weren't going to be pushed around. It's also possible that he knew surrender meant death, and by now he must have understood what the Khan did to those who had insulted him. 6 years earlier, Genghis Khan and his armies had breached the Great Wall and entered the Jurchen Jin lands for the first time. With the Mongols at the gates of the Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern Beijing, the Golden Khan of the Jin offered Genghis gold, silver, and silk, with the promise of more tributes to come. Genghis Khan agreed to spare Zhongdu, but rather than playing ball and becoming a vassal to Genghis, the Golden Khan moved south to establish a new capital at Kaifeng. Genghis was enraged. When he returned to Zhongdu in 1215, his approach was evidently so terrifying that the city commanders Wanyan Chenghui and Moran Jinzhong switched sides. The city was sacked. Tens of thousands were put to the sword, and the world had a taste of what Genghis Khan did to unruly enemies. For Inalchuk, this meant one of the most horrific deaths imaginable. Genghis had already moved on by the time that Inalchuk was executed, dividing his army and heading west to Bukhara. So it was his sons, Chagatai and Ogadai, who did the honours. It seems they wanted a symbolic way to avenge the death of the merchants. There's a caveat to this, though. Like with so many stories from those Mongol conquests, it is possible that it never happened. Genghis Khan's rampage across Central Asia was astonishingly destructive. As we'll see, entire cities and regions, and even a whole empire, were systematically destroyed. As Chagatai and Ogadai busied themselves with annihilating Otrar and subjugating Inalchuk to symbolic cruelty in February 2020, Genghis Khan and youngest son Tului had Bukhara under siege. This was the home of one of the intellectual jewels of the medieval world, the 45,000 books of the Khazana al-Hekmah, or Treasury of Wisdom. Genghis Khan wasn't necessarily anti-intellectual. He'd famously given the Mongolians a written language by working with the captured Uyghur scholar Tata Tonga, but by this point he was most certainly and resolutely anti-Khwarezmian. He decimated the city's garrison, using captured Bukharans as human shields. He rolled his catapults and mangonels up the walls of the inner citadel and laid it to waste. Bukhara, its library, and most of its people were destroyed. As a final flourish, Genghis blamed the citizens of Bukhara for their own downfall. At the city's Friday mosque, the Khan gave an address saying, quote, "If you had not committed such great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The following month at Samarkand, Genghis did the whole prisoners as human shields thing again. It worked. Genghis used captured Bukharans to shield his troops as he manoeuvred into position. Samarkand lasted only 5 days under siege. The city broke after a sortie involving a regiment of war elephants failed to puncture the Mongol lines. Sensing his victory, Genghis offered mercy to anyone who surrendered. But after accepting the surrender, he promptly changed his mind and had them executed. The war elephants that had survived the sortie were released into the desert, where they too died. As Genghis pillaged his way across Central Asia in 2020, he left once flourishing centres of knowledge and learning in ruins. One such place was Balkh in Afghanistan, which was a vibrant and cosmopolitan trading hub, home to Persian, Turkish, Jewish and Indian communities. 100,000 of the Khan's horsemen destroyed Balkh. The city would rise again, though. Genghis's descendant, Timur, would even proclaim his Khanate from here in 1359. But for centuries, a once shining beacon of humanity was left in ruins in the desert. When Genghis Khan arrived in Urgench, in today's Turkmenistan, in 2021, he was eager to continue the pattern he'd begun. At first, however, he seemed to offer an olive branch to the city, which was controlled by the mother of Shah Muhammad, Turkan Khatun. Genghis's overtures towards Turkan were warm and cordial. It was her son who was the enemy, he said, not her. But Turkan Khatun was unconvinced. She fled with her family, and Genghis Khan would chase and catch up with them. The men were executed, and the women, including Turkan herself, were kept in captivity for the rest of their days. The city was also destroyed. However, like many other victims of Genghis Khan's wrath, this city would again rise from the ashes. 150 years later, Ibn Battuta would describe Konya Urgench, meaning Old Urgench, as vibrant and bustling, as international trade networks flooded its coffers. But when the Mongols sacked it back in 2021, make no mistake, it would have been hell on earth. Shah Muhammad had died by spring of 2021, so Genghis turned his attention to the Shah's son, Jalaluddin. Hopefully, it's not too much of a spoiler to tell you that Jalaluddin was the last Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire. Impressed by the courage and tenacity of his grandson Mutuk Khan, son of Chagatai, Genghis sent the 15-year-old forward to take Bamyan in modern Afghanistan. A favourite of his grandfather, the youngster was struck by an arrow in battle and fatally wounded. Following Mutuk Khan's death, Genghis ordered soldiers to kill every living thing in the Bamyan Valley. The Shara-e-Gorgola fortresses proved the most difficult obstacle in this task. It held out for months. Now, just like he'd done with Turkin, Genghis used the female relatives of his enemies to gain what he wanted. He convinced Jalaluddin's own daughter that she could save herself if she betrayed her father's citadel and offered her hand to the Khan in marriage. This meant certain death for everyone inside, and they were murdered as soon as the Mongols gained entry. The city became known variously as the City of Woe or the City of Sorrow. Rather more disturbingly, it was also known as the City of Noise for the blood-curdling wail of those put to death within its walls. Jalaluddin's daughter was not saved, predictably. Genghis Khan had her executed too, shortly after the fall of Bamyan. The Khan also revived another of the old practices. He ethnically cleansed the Bamyan Valley of the indigenous Afghan peoples, just like he'd done before in Mongolia with the Merkids. His genocide was completed when he replaced them with Mongol soldiers, which radically changed the ethnic makeup of the region for centuries after. With his sons as his generals, Genghis could essentially guarantee maximum brutality and also efficacy wherever his armies went. A chilling example of this comes from spring 1221, when Tolu Khan arrived at Merv in Turkmenistan. At the dawn of the 13th century, Merv was probably the biggest city on the planet, home to 500,000 people and a beacon of lush prosperity on an arid stretch of the Silk Road. The city is an often overlooked wonder of the medieval world. By the time Tolu approached, however, the city's defenders understood what was coming. Rather than resisting, they opened the gates, welcoming Tolu and his army with open arms. It was a futile gesture. Tolu sacked the city and murdered its inhabitants. Some accounts suggest 700,000 died in the onslaught. This is likely to be an exaggeration, but the true number must still be enormous nonetheless. Just to make sure, though, of Merv's total and complete demise, Tolu's forces shattered the Murgat River Dam, removing the oasis that had once sustained Merv for centuries. Today, the city's ruined walls stand as an eerie testament to its former greatness and to the horror it witnessed in the spring of 2021. As Tolu Khan pushed southwest into Persia in April 2021, terrified enemy commanders debated what to do. Probably aware of the catastrophe at Merv, the garrison of Nishapur decided to stand and fight. They were going to die anyway. They might as well do it bravely. In fact, Nishapur put up one hell of a fight. Unable to smash the city in a frontal assault, Tolu turned to his ranged units. Skilled Mongol artillery rained down stone and fire upon the city, when finally a hole was punched in its defences, and Mongol infantry fought through the city's streets, leaving vast numbers of dead in their wake. Once the city had been pacified, the killing did not stop. In his campaigns against the Tatars, Genghis Khan had become known for the cart test. In other words, the entire male population would be measured against the axle of a cart. Those who were taller than the axle were killed. By the Battle of Nishapur, however, the Mongol armies had abandoned this test. At Nishapur, the entire population was systematically slaughtered. Severed heads were thrown into 3 vast piles, one for adult males, one for adult females, and another for children. The Mongols did understand the value of some of Nishapur's residents, though. A select few stoneworkers, artisans, and other skilled individuals were spared and sent off to work in some other corner of the empire. The rest, however, some 170,000 people, were killed. In just 2 short years, the Mongols had swept across the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis had defeated and harried the empire's final 2 shahs, killed hundreds of thousands of troops and civilians, and essentially wiped some of the greatest cities on the planet off the map. The death toll is believed to be 1.25 million, or a quarter of the empire's entire population. The destruction of Khwarezm essentially gave the Mongols a blueprint for invasion, subjugation, and destruction. Over the next 6 years, Genghis and his generals enacted these policies again and again. They led campaigns into the Tangund Western Shia Empire in northern China, into Volga Bulgaria and Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. After 2027, Mongol invasions continued right across the continent, creating a sprawling empire that stretched from far eastern Siberia and Korea to the steppes of Eastern Europe. By this point, however, Genghis Khan himself was no more. Somewhere in the lands of the Western Shia, during the winter of 1226 to 27, Genghis Khan fell from his horse during a hunting trip. Over the next year, he grew increasingly frail. Taunted by one of the Shia commanders, however, Genghis refused the advice of his generals and kept up the conquest in northwestern China. During the siege of Zhongxing, the great unifier of the Mongols and the terror of Asia finally died. On either the 18th or the 25th of August 2027, Genghis Khan, the man, became Genghis Khan, the legend, as he slipped beyond the bounds of life into the immortality of fiction and fable. And this is what we've been dealing with ever since. Take the circumstances of the Khan's death as an example. Marco Polo, writing decades later, believed he was shot by an arrow fired from Zhongxing, which isn't too far-fetched. Giovanni Carpini, who visited in the 1240s, believed he'd been struck by lightning, which is a little more fanciful. Rashid al-Din said he'd been suffering from some disease like malaria or bubonic plague. This too could actually be quite likely. What's unfortunately not likely is the story of the beautiful Göbelchin, the former wife of the Shia emperor. In later centuries, it was said that Göbelchin had seduced the great Khan, and then, once she had him naked and vulnerable, she castrated him with a dagger. The scourge of Eurasia would have died in agony, emasculated and bleeding out, as his manhood dangled before him. Whoever wrote that story probably thought it was a fitting end for such a tyrant, but it's almost certainly not true. What may be true, however, is what came next. While Genghis Khan remains a symbol of pride in Mongolia to this day, his final resting place has never been found. This is because great lengths were taken to keep the burial site secret. Speaking to the BBC's Erin Craig in 2017, a Mongolian translator named Yulen explained, "They went through all that effort to hide his tomb. If they'd wanted us to find it, they would have left some sign." The story goes that Genghis' army carried him home to a sacred location in the lands he'd grown up in. On the way, they murdered anyone they encountered. No witnesses were left to tell the tale of where they were heading or the route they'd used to get there. Once they'd buried their leader, 1,000 horsemen trampled the site flat, so no trace remained. Genghis Khan's body lay in an anonymous grave beneath the sprawling blue of the Mongolian sky. The man who had struck terror into millions of people, and whose name still carries enormous weight today, almost 800 years on, was returned to the earth and became a part of the land that had birthed him. But not before one last flourish of extreme violence was carried out in his name.